Welcome, everybody.
It's great to have everybody back. Today we're going to be talking about Locked Out, Felon Disenfranchisement and American Democracy. So I think this is a really important book. I think, number one, because we very often don't tend to think about prisons or folks who are incarcerated, right? Prisons are like over there and we ignore them and we ignore what happens in them. And we have this whole construction in American society about like criminals or people who are incarcerated, and they're seen as less than or lesser. Of course, most of us, I assume most of us in this conversation know that. I mean, Timothy, you were saying you've done ministry in prisons. I've taught in prisons. Everybody, I'm assuming everybody on this call is probably a criminal because we've all broken the law in some way, shape, or form, right? A lot of people smoke pot and don't get caught. You cross the red light, whatever. It's just that our crimes have not been the ones that were targeted in the way that other crimes are. And also, I would also say as a white person, I'm very unlikely to end up being targeted. So what I think is so important about this book is, it makes us consider felons and ex-felons or people who are designated as such, and thinking about this connection between the carceral state or incarceration and democracy, which is not, often a connection that we make when we're thinking about democracy and what that means and voting rights and whose voting rights are limited. We tend not to think about folks who are incarcerated. So it really opens up a whole other way to be thinking about these issues. So did anybody look up, by the way, the current state of affairs in Louisiana in terms of felon disenfranchisement, or does anybody know about the major changes to that happened pretty recently? I'm gonna go with a no then. So it was, I don't remember if it was last year or 2 years ago, but there was a major organizing to challenge the felon disenfranchisement law here in Louisiana. And so now, so this book came out in 2008. So some of their stats are, or some of the info they have about felon disenfranchisement has shifted a little bit, and Louisiana is one of those states. So now it is ex-felons who have stayed out of prison for 5 years since being released are now eligible to vote. So that was a major victory. It is still, obviously, there's still more room there, right? In terms of folks who are currently incarcerated, that would be another battle to get them to vote, and then trying to, get rid of that 5-year lag time. But anyway, so that was a major victory that activists were able to make happen here in Louisiana, and that was very, very recently. So but for the most part, right, I mean, all the different state laws continue to be just this like motley mixture of disenfranchisement laws. I can actually show you all, if I can share my screen for a minute. Let me see. This is a really good website, y'all. The sentencingproject.org. So they have this felony disenfranchisement primer. And this is published in 2019, but their stats are from 2016. So you see, and this is very similar to what we read in the book, 6.1 million Americans can't vote due to these disenfranchisement laws. And they have this table here with all the, various states and what they allow and what they don't allow. And they've also updated it. So you see there's the little footnotes here. And so they have the changes that happened in 2017, 2018, 2019, so on and so forth. So anyway, if anybody's interested in, just checking in on what's going on with those laws currently, the Sentencing Project is a really, really good resource. And it's really interesting, as we read in the book too, that the only 2 states that have no restrictions are Maine and Vermont. So anyway, just wanted to share that with y'all real quick. But let's talk about the book. So maybe we'll start with what you all want to talk about tonight instead of jumping right into the questions. Was there something in particular from the book that resonated with you, or something that you really wanted to talk about from what you read, or something that really, I mean, I learned a ton from what I read, but anything that stood out to y'all, or topics you wanted to talk about from what we read? Or I can also start with a focused question.
I didn't get a chance to read it. This is a busy time for me, and I just could not get a chance to read more than the first couple of pages. So I'm not coming in blind though, because I know a little bit about what happens with the voting and that kind of thing. But whatever you want to talk about is fine.
Okay. And it was also, I mean, admittedly, it was a pretty dense book. I mean, there's a lot of statistics and, so it's just full of information. So even I found myself having to like go back sometimes and just look back through the notes, because it was so chock full and in a really, really good way. Well, then, what do you all think about then? Let's talk about then this whole concept of felon disenfranchisement. Like, what do you all think about people losing their voting rights if they're incarcerated? What do we think is like the theory behind that? Why would that happen? Why might people argue against it? I don't know. What do y'all think?
I also did not read the book this week. My time for reading was right after I got my COVID shot, and I've been like, I haven't been able to stay awake. But
Congrats on getting your COVID shot. That's good news.
thanks. I was really happy about it. But then I have just been out of commission. But I think that like I've read The New Jim Crow, which is obviously a much more like, it's not as like graphs and charts and stuff like that, but it has like some of that. And it seems that like denying felons the vote is, like you were saying, like we create a class of people like criminals, and it's officially like something that's colorblind, but then you have to think about who is targeted as a so-called criminal, and to be made into a felon, and to then that those people's lives, like disenfranchising them almost seems to a lot of people to be the right thing to do, or the just thing to do, because we've created this class of people who have done so much wrong, or who are so wrong and just disposable now, that we don't want to think about them or have them participate in civic life.
I mean, it's fascinating, y'all. So let's just talk about like prisons and like, yeah, this creation of criminals and prisoners, right? I mean, like, we create this whole system, and what ends up happening, right, is that these people are seen, as Ashley is saying, as disposable, right? So, and we're really driven by retribution, right? When people do bad things, and people do bad things, we want revenge, we want retribution, right? So it's really interesting how we construct, to the point where what happens to people when they're incarcerated almost becomes irrelevant, right? I mean, like our prisons and jails in this country, there are, we couldn't even count the amount of human rights violations that are happening every single day in prisons, jails, and detention centers in this country. But because of the way we just categorize people, it's like we can't see their humanity, and we deny their humanity. And therefore there's this regressive retribution punishment. And part of that, right, is a loss of voting rights. So Thomas is saying that they should lose their rights. I don't know if Thomas, this is what you think, or if this is the kind of construction, but they lose their rights. Those that have an extensive rap sheet should never be allowed to vote. Why should my rights be cheapened? I guess I don't really know what that means. Multiple offenders place themselves in that situation. Do you want to tell us like a little bit more about what you're saying there, Thomas, just to kind of.
So I'd like to comment while Thomas is typing out his
Yeah.
response. You know, I feel like if you are convicted and you are in prison, you know, the way this happens is you're a ward of the state at that
Yeah.
point. And you know, I mean, we have to have some sort of a situation for prison. I have seen, and I will tell you this, which is kind of funny, prisoners that have been in state prison versus prisoners that have been out on these programs. A lot of them would rather be in prison because they say the programs in prison are better than the programs in the transition kind of thing. So the prison has a lot of different programs if they use it, especially Alcoholic Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous and that kind of thing. But I do believe that when you are convicted and you are brought to prison, I feel like you should lose your right to vote at that point, as well as rights of other things. But when they get out of prison, I feel like when someone is released from prison, the state is telling us that this person should be let out and they should have their rights fully restored.
Mhm.
And so, as far as I'm concerned, if somebody gets out of prison and they've paid their so-called debt to society, I feel like all of their rights should be restored back to them, or they shouldn't be let out of prison, because if they're not ready, the state shouldn't be letting them out. So, to me, I can't believe that a person who's out of prison can't vote. That just doesn't make sense to me, because they are now a citizen again. They're no longer a ward of the state. They are a citizen at that point. And, you know, because they have been let out. I don't understand why they need to have, I understand why they may need a transition situation. But when it comes to that kind of stuff, holding a job, being able to vote, being able to do all the other things that citizens can do, I just can't understand why we're not giving them those rights, you know. And that's what's so good about this new law that came about in Louisiana, I think. You know, and to me, I wish it was the day after they get out. I don't even know why we got to wait 5 years on that. You know, the day after they're citizens again.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because if you look at, you know, folks with felony convictions, and that's the other thing. Let's think about like, what are felonies? Like, what do you all know about what constitutes a felony? Like, what's the difference between a felony and a misdemeanor? Because I think we also have a lot of false information, or like what we imagine, like who a felon is or what a felony is, tends to be very like, well, wrong. So like, what is a felony? What is a misdemeanor? How do we understand those things? Who can answer that?
Well, sometimes felonies are different from a misdemeanor by a degree of money. Like, for instance, you steal under this amount, it's a misdemeanor, but you go over $1 and it's a felony case. They've even taken the level of that and moved it up even more, which I'm not so sure is good, but you know, they've even done that. So but you know, you have different, I mean, and sometimes the disparity in sentencing on some of these things is really something, you know. You know, there's people that have killed someone, and you know, maybe they get 15 years. They killed a pit bull and they got 45. Okay. So in law, is the dog more important than a person? It should be at least the same, at least, you know, that kind of thing. There's a lot of disparities in different things, but it's not because the laws are looked at as one whole type of system. These laws have been put into effect over a couple of centuries in Louisiana's situation, because we've been a state for over 200 years. So, you know, some of these laws have been on the books for a long time. They were put in piecemeal. So you have a lot of situations that make it for those disparities that maybe not because they did it all at one time, they did it over 2 centuries time, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the sentencing structure is a hot mess, I think, to put it in very academic and scholarly words. But Timothy's right? A felony is typically separated from a misdemeanor. Like felonies, and I'm pulling straight from the book here, right, are seen as like high crimes, typically crimes that have sentences of a year or more, versus misdemeanors that are like lower crimes, right? But the thing with felonies, right, I mean, you can get a felony conviction. Oh yeah, and also, and they have all these beautiful charts and graphs in there. They show that only 8% of felonies are actually like the violent crimes that we imagine: murder, rape, and armed robbery. That only accounts for 8% of all felony convictions. That the majority of felony convictions are non-violent crimes like property crimes, and a third of those crimes, if I'm right, yeah, a third of them are drug related, right? So you get caught selling weed 3 times or however many, I don't know exactly, but then, right, you get charged with a felony. So sometimes too, right, we think of like felonies as these like, we imagine them as like murderers or serial rapists, but a lot of felons are actually committing nonviolent crimes, drug crimes, and these are oftentimes crimes of survival, right? They're selling drugs because that's how they're, trying to make money to survive. And we don't need to debate, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or, other choices people have or what have you, but like, that's the reality of the situation. So anyway, I just want to kind of make that clear when we're talking about ex-felons and felons and who people are and the crimes they've committed. It's important to keep in mind that it's surprising. I was surprised as I was reading and being reminded that a lot of folks who get stamped, as felons, probably aren't really, the crimes that they've committed are not these kind of monstrous acts that we tend to imagine them to be. Sorry, Ashley, you were going to say something?
Sorry. I'm sorry. I was just gonna say as well, and I could be remembering incorrectly because it was a while since I've read about this, but in depth, but like even things like taking plea deals can, if you are poor and your public defender says, I don't think you can win this in a trial, and you don't have the resources and you don't trust in a jury being able to not convict you, you plead for a lesser sentence, but you're still branded as a felon and you're still disenfranchised and you still have, hard time finding a job after. So even if you didn't commit a crime in the first place, when you plead, you make that plea, and then you go and try and find a job, it's going to be harder to find a job in the legal world. And then, you may get caught up in things that are illegal because to make ends meet. So I think it's important to keep in mind that sometimes who becomes a felon is not strictly based on guilt. And certainly there are people who commit these crimes, but it doesn't correlate exactly.
Absolutely. And that's such an important point, because when we're looking at crime and punishment in this country, it's absolutely predicated on these lines of race and class. And since you brought up class, right? Imagine who has the money to be bailed out of jail. If you're a poor person, you don't. Who has the money to afford a good lawyer, right? If you're a poor person, you don't. So the system is absolutely set up so the odds are against poor people. And those are going to be the majority of the people that you're going to find waiting in jails and being convicted. Or as Ashley's pointing out, right, you take the plea deal because, it's all about trying to make that negotiation, trying to figure out what's going to, what's going to be the best option, right? Public defenders, they have caseloads of God only knows how many, right? I mean, 50 plus, I don't even think I'm exaggerating, right? So very often the public defender is meeting with his client or her client the moment they're stepping into the courtroom. So the whole system is just completely inadequate in terms of like the resources and supports that are in place, but also it's absolutely stacked up against poor people. And there's no doubt about it. And there's plenty of evidence and scholarship that absolutely shows that. I think something else that Timothy pointed out is really important to think about too is, and another piece that I also learned from the book, I can't remember what the percentage is, but people who are serving felony sentences who are incarcerated, a lot of those are folks who were released, but then because they, didn't follow probation or something happened, right, with the probation, something went, they end up back in prison. So you have a lot of folks who had served their time, but because they didn't follow the rules of the probation, end up back in prison. That's something that's something else I didn't even think about. But anyway, so as Timothy was saying, right, when somebody has a felony conviction and then they're released, in this country, there is no, okay, clean slate, you get to start again, you've served your time, you're rehabilitated, you move on. That's not the truth, right? What happens to somebody who has a felony conviction on their record? What are they going to face in the world that someone like me, who does not have a felony conviction, never has to deal with?
You're gonna have to put it on your resume, or on a job. Employers are allowed to ask you that,
Yep.
and you're gonna face roadblocks getting public assistance if you come into some hard times. And you're also able, like, if you don't own a home, and poor people are more likely to be targeted for felony to have a felony conviction. When you're going to rent, you can also be asked that. So you may have a hard time finding a place to live as well as a job.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, right? That X is on the record for the rest of your life. And there are very few companies that will hire ex-felons. UPS is one of them, but many companies. So already, right, people, it's like the scarlet letter, right? I mean, it's just like people are marked for the rest of their lives as having been felons. So finding work, incredibly difficult. Finding housing, I think, for like, what's it called? Like subsidized housing. I think you become ineligible if you have a felony conviction. In all these different ways, people are then blocked from being able to make a better life for themselves, continue, and become productive citizens. So again, the odds are just completely stacked against people, even though supposedly, right, they've served their time, they've, or what was like paid their debt to society or whatever, but then they come out of prison and that's not the reality that they're going to face, right? It's like the felony is going to follow them for the rest of their lives. And we have to think about, and part of that is in voting rights, right? When people are, disenfranchised for the rest of their lives, or for a particular amount of time, right? As Thomas said, like former felons applying for their voting rights after a time period, you have no problem with that, right? So I guess one of our questions then is like, why is it that some states, it's like this, why is it that some states, like what motivates some governors or lawmakers to agree with Thomas and say former felons should be able to apply for their voting rights after a time period, and what might motivate other people not to allow that? Right. And again, like, how are we constructing our ideas about who felons are or ex-felons are? And again, that need for like retribution and punishment that literally is going to follow. Somebody's being punished literally for the entire rest of their lives under our current system. So there is no room for people to ever get out of that, that kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? That they're just like forever felons, right? Thomas, to be cynical, one political party has no problems adding former felons to their voting base for support. Yeah, I don't know, but see, this is what's interesting, because this is actually, I'm glad you brought this up with the political parties. Something that was brought up in the book, because there were some, in the book, they were talking about, if I'm remembering correctly, that Republicans were against felons having the right to vote because they would vote for Democrats. So that would hurt the Republican Party. And obviously, because they would be not getting those votes. And it was interesting because what the authors were arguing was, you don't give people voting rights based on who they're going to vote for. you give people voting rights because they should have the right to vote regardless of whether they're voting for you or someone else, right? Because supposedly in a democratic society, our goal is universal suffrage. But yeah, everything is absolutely political, right? But it was an interesting argument that the authors were looking at for reason, arguments for felon disenfranchisement, because Republicans didn't like that Democrats might get more votes. But what'd be interesting, and I don't know that most felons are going to vote Democrat or Republican. In one of the chapters, they actually, they interviewed a bunch of folks, I think maybe 35 folks who were either currently or formerly incarcerated in Minnesota. And they're not all Democrats. They don't all vote Democrat. But if most ex-felons would vote Democrat, it's interesting to wonder why. Like, what are the policies of that party versus the policies of the Republican Party? Although really in the past, as they also talk about in the book, right, in the past 30 years, the Democrats have fully gotten on board with the tough on crime, truth in sentencing. Some of the harshest criminal justice reform in this country in the past 30 years was under Bill Clinton, right? So we often also tend to think of it as like the Republican Party is the party of law and order, and they're the ones who, created and expanded mass incarceration. But in truth, the Democrats had just as much to do with that as the Republicans did. So that's also a really interesting history to look into. And why was there this push for higher rates of conviction? Because at the same time, as they show in the graphs in the book, as you see rates of incarceration skyrocketing, rates of crime are going down. So it's totally incongruous. It doesn't make any sense. Right? So when scholars are explaining mass incarceration and what that was all about. So yeah. The past summer seems to have changed their tune. I'm not sure whose tune you're talking about, Thomas. Give me more info so I know what you're talking about here.
I would say this though. I bet you that if we were to give felons the ability to vote the day they get out, the day they get out of prison, I bet you we will find out that they're not going to be habitual voters. I bet you that they're probably going to vote. This is just a hunch of mine, but I'm thinking that they're probably only going to vote at about a 20 or 25% situation anyway. I get the idea from the people that I see in prison. I don't think that they are really worried about voting, but those that are should have the ability to vote, so.
And what is the voting rate in the country in general? I know this last presidential election we saw, never before seen numbers, but like typically, what do y'all know? Is it like 30% of people of voting age vote? Do you know, Timothy?
I would say it's probably pretty close because you have a big, like you said about the presidential election, but then you also have an election like we had just this past weekend for District 2. And I think that only 15 or 16% voted in District 2. And to tell you the truth, it was mostly Republicans that did not vote.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure what all that was about, but so anyway, that's what happened. So you see, you have the ability to vote in I want to say there was something like 16 candidates or 15 candidates for this one spot. Okay. And it was the primary. Now they have a runoff, but even with that many candidates, you would think that they would be able to get the vote out. They'd have, staff to help get that vote out and everything, but they didn't. Yeah. And so, because people just don't look at off cycle elections being important.
Right.
And so, I guess you got to deal with that.
Yeah. It's fascinating because when we look at some other industrialized democratic nations like in Europe, their rates of voting, I think are like in the 70% or 80%. It is abysmal how few people vote here. And we have to think about why is that, right? So number one, obviously there's tons of barriers to voting. We know disenfranchisement is part of American history. It says American as apple pie, but also that, you know, there isn't this culture around voting, the importance of voting, of participating in the democracy. So it's like there need to be like a culture shift, right? There's more people who vote during the presidential election because that's seen as important. But I would argue that it's actually those local grassroots elections, those statewide elections that are going to have a much greater impact on our lives than those presidential elections, right? Ashley, what were we going to say?
I was just gonna be numbers. This past presidential election had, I think, 63 or 62%. Of course, those are presidential. The past two midterm elections, which again is a national level thing, so I would think that local ones would probably be lower, but just from what I see when I go to the polls. But the last two, so 2014 and 2018 actually had respectively the lowest and the highest percentage of turnout in the last 40 years or over almost 50 years. So in 2014, only 41.9% of people showed up, and in 2018, 53.4% of people showed up.
Okay, well, it's higher than I thought it was going to be, because I thought we were down in the 30s or below. So
that's just from the census. So
yeah,
I think it's probably right.
yeah.
But you see, if you drill into those numbers a little bit more, those particular elections are happening in the fall, even though it may be midterms, it's still happening in the fall. And usually there's a lot more people that vote in the fall because there is other things to vote for. You're voting for some local council, group,
Yeah.
or you're voting for governor or secretary of state or whatever the case may be. So even though we think of it maybe as kind of being an off election, it really isn't. It's in the fall, but still only 40% of the vote. That's why you see that, and then you come down to some election that happens in May and March or April, and you're down to 15% or 13%, which is really strange. And those are the kind of elections that people get in on, that sneak in, I think, on certain types of things that would never have gotten elected if it would have been a fall election.
Totally. Because they're almost banking on people not voting, right? And this is something that's so interesting too, when you think about it, like, why is, like, let's talk about like election day. And like, so when we're thinking about like access to the vote, because this is something else that they brought up in the book too, like, why isn't, like, election day should be, is election day actually a federal holiday? It's not, right? People still have to work on election day.
It's a holiday for federal if there's a presidential election. The presidential election is the only election that happens on a Tuesday in Louisiana. Right. All the other elections are going to be on a Saturday.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm just thinking about, like, again, like our culture around voting and people's ability to vote and access to the vote, and thinking about just like what mechanisms are in place to ensure that people can or cannot vote. It's just, I don't know, something I've been thinking about.
Like, if you are off of work, you're more likely to be working on the weekends, on the Saturdays, if you have a lower paid job. And so can you get a ride there? Can you get off of work? Mm-hmm. If you live in a poorer place, your polling place is likely to be further away from you, making it harder to get there. And of course, you need transportation to get to the polls. Whereas I think, like, Australia, if I'm not mistaken, they like send a ballot, like every single person is expected to vote, whereas we kind of across the political spectrum have found all these ways to limit people whose interests may be different from the ruling classes interest, or the more affluent or more whatever classes, to keep them from participating in civic life in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, when we're looking historically, like which political parties were disenfranchising, that changes over time because the political parties change over time, right? And this is not a partisan thing to say, but I will tell you guys right now that if you want to look at which political party is making voting more difficult, is seeking disenfranchise, there is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's the Republican Party. Every single measure that will ultimately limit the vote is being introduced by Republicans. And that's not, that's just the truth. And that's something that we really need to pay attention to and be very, very concerned about because, and actually, as we'll read about this next week in next week's book, if you all do the readings, one person, no vote, there's just been this incredible flurry of legislation since the last presidential election to disenfranchise. I mean, they wouldn't call it disenfranchise, but to limit people's access to the vote and voting rights. And it's incredibly troubling. Timothy, your mic is off.
Or it was on.
Oh, it was. That's what I meant.
I don't know what it was. Well, I think, but I don't know if I think I disagree with that to a degree because, in Louisiana, the polls open at 6 and close at 8.
Mhm.
I've never had a problem with going to vote.
Mhm.
When I worked at a job that was a split shift, was horrible. It was a split shift. I barely had, with this COVID rules, I barely had the ability to go and shop for groceries because they were opening later and only people could go if you were a senior citizen, and then they were closing at 6, and it just was it was hard to get to go shopping. However, if they would have stayed, if they'd have been open at 6 to 8 for me, well, okay, I could have made that. Plus, we have a lot of days that we can early vote. And if there is a situation where they have to, they're sick or they're an invalid or some sort of way, they can absentee vote. If they're going to be out, out of the state or whatever, they can absentee vote. I think that we give our people a good chance to vote. And now that early voting, you can go to a couple of different places, no matter what precinct you're in, and go vote is very, very good because it makes it so easy. And now what's happening is not only is it easy, it is almost in and out now. I've noticed every time that I've gone now, I only early vote because I don't want to have to worry about what I'm going to do on the day of voting if I'm going to be around. But I think we get like 8 days to early vote or something like that.
Something like that,
So
yeah.
one of the things that I find that's so great about it is that when you go early vote, they bring, it's almost like your ID is a credit card now. What they do is they take your ID and it gets it.
Oh yeah, they
It goes into the machine, it comes out, they give you a little pass, some kind of little pass that goes to whatever machine, and you know that it's you, and then you go and you do whatever. I think it's worked really well in Louisiana. I think we've actually done pretty good for our people. But I will say this, I think that I don't know if I hate to say we need to advertise to vote, but there are just people that's not going to vote. And
Oh yeah, no doubt.
and
Right.
twisting their arm is not going to help. But I always said, maybe if they pump these off-cycle elections a little bit more, maybe more people would vote. But then again, I'm thinking, I'm not so sure, maybe those stupid signs on the side of the road that we see by the millions actually help people go vote, because off-cycle elections don't have as many signs,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know. It's just silly that people don't. I've probably only ever missed 1 or 2 very minor elections in my whole life, and to give a plug, I turned 58 today. So
Happy birthday.
thank you. But, so I see this and I'm thinking, on the day I turned 18, I was at the post office signing up for selective service and for to vote the day I turned 18, because that was important to me. And I just don't understand why they miss. I see it happen all the time. Oh, I didn't even go vote. I didn't even know. And I'm like, well, you didn't see all those signs? Come on.
Yeah. Well, so you're bringing up a lot of really good points here. Number one is, so your experience has been it's very easy to vote in Louisiana. And as Renee has said here in the chat, right, in Texas and Georgia, they've made it much more difficult for folks to vote. And that's true. So what we want to look at, there's a lot of attacks on early voting. There's been a lot of legislation to try to get rid of that in multiple jurisdictions. I'm not sure if it's here in Louisiana, but there's been attacks on that, try to get rid of early voting, try to get rid of mail-in ballots. So all these ways that we've made, we've tried to make voting as accessible and as easy as possible. All of those things are now under attack. So that's something that we really have to be worried about. So next week's book, we'll talk a lot more about that. So you'll see that what's going on. So regardless of whether people will vote or not, I think what we need to focus on or thinking about is that we do kind of meet this standard of universal suffrage. And then we want to think about, if people aren't voting, why not? I find it very easy to vote in Louisiana, but I also think I'm extremely well-resourced, well-educated person. It would be interesting to talk to folks who've had different life experiences than all of us, right? And to try to get a sense of what is it that keeps people from voting. Is it just they don't care? Or is there actually a lot more going on there? Do they feel disenfranchised? Do they feel, do they not have the information they need to be able to vote? Even the fact that we have to register to vote, right? Like you and I, I can't just go to the polling place. I have to make sure I'm registered first. I mean, that creates another, not a barrier, but what's it called? Not a loophole. What am I looking? A little jumping.
A hoop to jump through.
A hoop to jump through, right? Why do we even have that hoop to jump through? There's a lot of countries that you're born and you turn 18 or whatever the age is, you're registered, right? In Ohio, they're notorious for if you haven't voted in an election in a particular amount of time, let's say it's 2 years or something, then they purge you from the registration rolls. And so then people will go to vote because they think they're registered, but they've been purged from the rolls. Why would a state purge people, right? Shouldn't the goal be to get as many people voting as possible instead of trying to limit votes and keep voters voting down, right? It's totally fascinating. So we need to ask ourselves, why does this happen? So let's see, what did raise? Okay, so Thomas, power flicker. Oh, but you're still here. Good. We hope you don't lose power, Thomas. Renee says there are people that I work with that just don't care, right? I've worked with one girl for 7 years. She has only voted a couple of times, and that was for presidential elections, nothing local. Yeah. Oh, Louisiana does the purging. Yeah, I mean, it's totally, yeah. So that's the thing, right? I mean, I think it's easy. I guess I would caution us against being oh, people just don't care, and the person is the problem. They don't want to vote. What's wrong with them? And maybe thinking about, why does the person feel so disenfranchised to begin with that they don't even think their vote matters? Do you know what I mean? What has been that person's life experience, or, what could we do as a society to increase the vote, right? To make people recognize that their votes do matter, that they do have a say in shaping, supposedly, right? I mean, we have it's a country of the people, by the people, right? But a lot of people don't believe that. And why don't they believe that, right?
I wonder if some of it, where my partner used to work at Home Depot, she had some work friends, and they all, none of them, they were younger, most of them were a little bit younger, and none of them was, even in this past presidential election, none of them was remotely interested in voting. And I wonder if it has something to do with, because it's not just young people, but I wonder if it has something to do with not feeling kind of unmoored from your community, and not seeing, even if you're a part of your community in other ways, not really understanding the ways that your vote and what's on the ballot can impact your life. There are a couple there was some things on the ballot in this past election, Louisiana specific things that when we were talking to these specific friends, they didn't know, and these things were on the ballot and what a profound impact it could possibly have on their lives. And it was past the time when they could register at that point. But like, I think maybe, I don't know what the answer is, but to kind of remedy it. But I think that sometimes people don't feel as rooted in seeing what their vote does to their own life, or lack there, or what not voting does to affect their own life.
Surely, because for a lot of people, politics is just something that kind of happens up there, out there, and people feel so disconnected from politics and politicians, which that's totally real, right? Thomas says, after 42 years, I changed my party to independent. I've become disgusted with the leadership at the top levels of both major parties. Hallelujah. I fully understand that. You know, and also, like, I know I have a couple friends who didn't vote in the last election because they were like, Trump, Biden, same thing. Like, what's the difference? It's, you know, the ruling class, people with money who are going to benefit, and the rest of us are screwed. So it doesn't really matter, you know, which powerful, rich, white dude you have as president. It doesn't really change much. I mean, that's, you know, that's one point of view. So there's all sorts of complex and complicated reasons why people don't vote, ranging from feeling totally disconnected and disenfranchised to feeling like, what's the point, right? And trying to understand those reasons, I think, you know, is an important exercise.
I think sometimes because of political rhetoric, we lose sight of things that do change. Like a lot of nuance get lost in the conversation, and the change can be so slow, but I'm much more happier and healthier being a woman today than I would have been in 1990. And a lot of that does have to do with legislation, and it's not perfect, but they're like, I do think that cynicism is probably a big part of it, and I understand it, but I also feel like whenever someone kind of says that to me, I'm like, you know, I get it, but like, you need to at least, you know, it's something that if you have the resource to get to, it's a fast, fairly easy, fairly fast process. Just do this one little thing.
Well, yeah, because legislation absolutely impacts our lives. Like, there's no doubt about it. There's just no doubt about it, right? Yeah, for sure.
Like felon legislation regarding you know, drug charges and all of that stuff, and drug crime.
Oh, and that was another really good point that they made in the book too. They were talking about, and this connects back to our conversation last week about, you know, the ruling elites. So they were talking about how definitions of which crimes were considered felonies or not have changed over time. And that is a lot of how we explain mass incarceration as well. But when we're looking at the history of criminalization, race is absolutely fully steeped into that history. And so they have these incredible examples from the Jim Crow era. So after the fall of Reconstruction, and you see an increase in incarceration of Black folks because the prisons provided free labor for companies and corporations and individuals, but like the railroad companies would use prison labor. A lot of corporations were using prison labor at that time. But in any case, so the crimes that get deemed felonies were the crimes that Black men were likely to commit, and the crimes that white men were likely to commit, it's really interesting, do not become deemed felonies. I'm not remembering exactly how they phrased it, but it was totally fascinating. But the same thing happened. So you see, you know, clearly the intersection of race, but the same thing was happening too. We were talking last week, and Timothy was talking about how, you know, there used to be property qualifications to vote. And I think property qualifications, I think, were abolished, and maybe it was 1848 or sometime like 1850, around that time. But what's so fascinating then is then you see that once we're moving closer to universal suffrage, that's when you see, I'm pretty sure that was when you see some more of these disenfranchisement laws were put into effect. Oh man, you guys, my memory is not serving me well, but basically it was basically as they were moving more towards universal suffrage for white men, the elite ruling class found ways to disenfranchise lower class white men. And one way was through criminalization. So it's just totally fascinating. It speaks to what we were talking about last week about these intersections of race and class, and how basically the ruling elites, and this is the language used in the book as well, found ways to disenfranchise folks, criminalize folks, so that then, for their own benefit. It's totally fascinating. So that's another really critically important part when we're looking at history of crime and criminalization, and crime and criminalization today, is that the intersection with class and race is absolutely salient, and just cannot be denied in terms of who is criminalized, and what, and who's not. So yeah, that was just another important piece. So when you guys do get around to reading the book, I'm telling you, it is chock full of good history, and it really helps make sense of, the current situation we're dealing with, which is, the United States is the leader of the world in terms of incarceration. We incarcerate more people than any single other country in the world. So.
I think, and as a parallel to that, or as like the way things, like a lot of times the systemic underlying problems that we have as society don't necessarily change, although the way we do them is different. If you look at the 80s and then in the 90s, and the way that when you have drug possession laws and distribution laws, crack cocaine was treated completely differently in terms of how much if you have a certain amount of crack cocaine and a certain amount of powder cocaine, the crack, you can have just a smaller amount, will send you to prison for a minimum, the mandatory minimum of a much longer sentence than even more. If you had more powder cocaine, then that would send you to prison for, or what you would be convicted for that. And that was specifically because, at least according to what I've read, it came about because crack cocaine was seen as a racialized substance.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of scholarship on that for sure. Sorry, Timothy, just to finish, there's been a ton of scholarship. Who was doing crack in the 80s is poor Black people. Who's doing cocaine in the 80s? It's white rich executives in their offices. So, right. And drug use actually even today is much higher amongst whites than it is amongst Blacks, or Black folks. But when you look at who's incarcerated for drug use, Black folks far exceed white folks, even though white people use drugs at it's either the same or a much higher rate than Black folks. It's totally fascinating. Timothy, go ahead.
So I cannot remember the book that I read on this, but there was, I read about where all these laws for crack cocaine came from. And I want to say they focused in on California, but I think there was some other states too. It was the inner city Black elected officials that pushed for very, very strong laws for crack cocaine, because their communities were getting roughed over and rocked over by all the murders and all of the things. So and I cannot remember the book that talked about that.
I think I know exactly what you're talking about. Was it Locking Up Our Own?
No, I don't know if it was that one. And I gotta tell you, I listen to a lot of books, so I don't see the front covers much.
Okay.
But this was something I read probably about 5 or 6 years ago. But they were saying, someone who was saying about how, it's a racial thing, but yet it was Black elected officials that were trying to get most of this passed. And I would say that probably your crack cocaine laws versus your regular cocaine laws were done at 2 different times. So that you know, when you look at something that's really going bad right now, I would think that you're going to have probably harsher sentences on something that's passed right now that's a real problem that people are griping about and complaining, than say something that was kind of going on 6, 10, 15 years ago, you know, because let's face it, crack was like late 80s and then
Mhm.
in the 90s, and cocaine was more like in the 70s, and it wasn't looked at as, there was a lot of murder around it. We know there was, but maybe not as much as crack cocaine, but we didn't see the I get the, what they call that when you have adjacent crimes that happen based on one thing, like, you know, you have,
Oh
you
yeah,
know, I can't remember what the, is it ancillary crimes, or I don't know,
maybe, but yeah,
something
there's,
like that.
yeah.
But you have certain times, certain types of drugs, depending on what it connects. Plus, crack was cheap,
Very
and
cheap.
it went through and it just devastated cities.
Yes.
Not unlike the, what happened with the all these people getting oxycodone, and
Yeah, the opioids, the
yeah, it just
opioid
happened.
epidemic and
I've
heroin and everything.
I've seen some stuff on that, and I'm like, but you know, I wanted to say something earlier about this too. You know, being in prison for many years, you know, as an observer, and I mean, I went every week for 5, 6 years until COVID. You know how they always say that the, you know, there's only innocent people in prison. You know, I'll tell you that's not true. The group that we had, 30, 40 different men, there was not but one of them that said that they were innocent.
Mhm.
And the one that said he was innocent, even the warden thinks he's innocent. It's not like he's saying it. The warden even thinks he's innocent because of the situation that happened. This was back in the 70s. A lot of them, unless they were, very few of them said or have told me they usually have had rap sheets a mile long. They committed many crimes, most of them, not all of them,
Mhm.
most of them. And what happens is, you know, you believe it or not, a lot of them will tell you the best thing ever happened was I went to prison, because it shook me up, and it made me start thinking about the selfishness that they had and what they were doing to others.
Hmm.
And so, you know, it's amazing when you hear that. Now you got to remember, this is a group that was in a ministry group,
Mhm.
and you can't be in that group if you don't have the best behavior. Okay. I mean, you gotta have the best behavior to go into these groups, because you got to know that the people that are going in as volunteers are going to be safe, you know. But so, you know, you have a select group there too that's going into that room with us, you know. So it's amazing how, you know, and how many times now do we hear, and I think the media is starting to pick up on this, is that when someone commits a crime and they go in and say, this is the 27th time this person's been arrested, and they go through, and a lot of the arrest is also arrest against some sort of violent crime against someone else, and you're like, wow, they didn't go to prison for that, you know, or what. You would think they would have went to prison for some of the things that they did, and they didn't. And so it's amazing how long these rap sheets can be. So some of these people are getting very many chances that they're not straightening up, and yet when they do go to prison, it's like, we're saying they had this long rap sheet. How did they not see that this was happening? They were abusive to other people many times, and now they've murdered somebody. We kind of, that should have put them on the radar, so to speak.
Mhm. Yeah. I guess I would like to see a world where people had the resources that they needed. You know, they could access the healthcare they needed, they could get the job training they needed, that like, so that prison wasn't a great alternative, right? I mean, imagine a world where people didn't end up in the situations where they were committing violent crimes. Imagine a world where people could get healthcare outside of prison, right? Some people only get healthcare when they're in prison. Some people only get mental health services when they're in prison. I just, you know, I imagine a world where people, their basic needs are met, and therefore they don't end up committing, either violent or non-violent crimes, because they don't have to, because they have other options, right? I mean, thinking about even these people with these rap sheets that are like, 20 miles long, they come out of prison, do they really have a chance? I mean, we were just talking about like ex-felons, what their record stays with them for life. Like how much of a chance do they have, right? Rates of recidivism are partially so high because the odds are so stacked against people. So yeah. I don't know. I always
They also do some dumb things too.
Oh yeah, people do
Some
dumb
of these
things.
people that go
Yeah.
back in prison, one of them was out and he was doing fairly good. He's been out for like 6, 7 months. He goes back in because he was driving his wife's car, and he was not drunk, but he was drinking while he was driving. But he did not. They gave him the breathalyzer, and he wasn't drunk. And so it was pretty much an open container situation at that point. And then he got all ticked off because he got stopped, and he mouthed off to the cop, and I think he ran. Well, okay, that's going to send you right back to prison.
Yeah.
I mean, he wasn't even off of probation yet or whatever. And he said it. He goes, I did the stupidest thing. And he goes,
Right.
I mean, but a lot of times people do those stupid things because they just can't handle, they just don't have the maturity sometimes to handle themselves in the right way, and they go right back, So I don't know. It's just sometimes, you just wish you could reprogram those people sometimes,
And you're like, come on, man. I get it, but like, I do a lot of dumb things too, but it doesn't, you know what I mean? Like it's, thinking about the kind of intense hyper scrutiny that people on probation or out of prison are onto. And then like this, the smallest dumb thing, right? Whereas we all do dumb things all the time and there's no impact on us, right? But yeah, it can be frustrating. But yeah, Timothy, I think the book, I recently read this book, Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America by James Forman. I really, really recommend it. Because, a lot of scholars are writing about mass incarceration and like, how did mass incarceration happen, right? And what I mean by that is, how do we go from a situation in 1970, I think we had 60,000 people locked up in prisons and jails in this country, right? Today, we have 2.1 million people locked up in prisons and jails in this country. We have 5% of the world's population, but we incarcerate 25% of the world's incarcerated, right? It's just, the figures are astronomical. We incarcerate, so in the United States, it's 715 people for every 100,000. We lead the world. I think Russia incarcerates like 549 for every 100,000. I don't know, Ashley, maybe do you want to Google this? Because I think just to make sure my numbers are right. Right. And then, but anyway, so scholars have asked this question of, how did mass incarceration happen? Because it doesn't just happen with like one decision. And that's part of what Forman is arguing. And this is what Timothy was talking about, and he's talking about Washington, D.C. specifically, but it is, Black folks in majority Black neighborhoods are sick and tired of the crime, and there's major drug epidemic happening with heroin at this time. Like the idea of like a drug epidemic that we're in right now, the opioid crisis, that's not the first drug epidemic we've ever dealt with. I mean, there's been the crack cocaine, but then before that you had heroin in the 70s, and it's absolutely devastating in Black neighborhoods. And so, Black politicians and legislators, I mean, they were all about being tough on crime, and locking people up. And that's why this is exactly the title of this book, Locking Up Our Own. And so, he's just talking about, one of the ways that you see the growth of mass incarceration. It's not necessarily always, like white folks making these decisions to incarcerate Black folks, which very often does get framed that way. And that is also part of the problem, because there's no doubt about it that a lot of these sentencing laws are absolutely racist. Criminalization is absolutely along racial lines. But you also, he was looking at another one of the vectors or points of origin, and that you saw, Black people were sick and tired of the violence in their neighborhoods, and they were also instituting these increased sentences, trying to increase rates of conviction to protect themselves, unfortunately, that didn't end up, it ends up with these like, massive, with the problem, part of the increase in mass incarceration, and it didn't actually resolve, because the drug epidemic is a medical crisis. It's not it leads to criminal behavior and activity as well, but ultimately, right, drug addicts are people who need medical attention. They don't need criminalization. Ashley, did you find my stats for me?
So this is from the BBC. In terms of sheer numbers, we lead the world. We have over 2 million people in prison. In terms of sheer numbers, China falls behind us. They have 1.5 million people, but per 100,000, we have 737, and they have 118. Russia falls behind us in terms of the rate of incarceration by about what you were saying, about 100. They have 874,000 people incarcerated, and that's 615 per 100,000. Yeah, and I don't know if it's the same now, but I remember looking a few years ago, and Louisiana, of course, has one of the highest rates.
Yeah,
in the world, period.
Yeah, we literally have the highest rate of incarceration, our state, on the entire globe, right? Because the United States incarcerates more people, and these are interesting statistics too, because even it's not about the numbers, but the per capita, right? So yeah, the United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the globe, and the Louisiana incarcerates more people than any other state in the nation. Although that recently changed because there was a change in sentencing laws or something. So I think Oklahoma now beats us as the most incarcerated state in the entire globe. But Louisiana held that position for a very long time. So
I
yeah.
also want to address what Renee said a little while ago about the crimes that tend to be committed by like white collar crimes, and how things like drug trafficking and like violent crime are absolutely can have deleterious kind of effects on communities, but the same effects are even worse. Like when we had the 2008 financial crisis, I don't remember exactly what happened to the people who were responsible for that, but that caused incredible incredible amounts of loss of property, incredible devastation to communities. And I don't believe that many of the engineers of that kind of crisis, or the people whose irresponsible behavior led to that crisis, were imprisoned, and certainly not in the same conditions that most people who are incarcerated in the United States are. And I'm not saying it's the same thing in one way or another, but it's like how we think about harm, I think, is interesting. And people who profit from other people's misfortune aren't necessarily criminalized, but they they still bring a lot of harm to and then of course we then that's added to the fact that a lot of depending on your socioeconomic and racial place in the world, it depends on whether you're being like followed to see if you commit any crimes and stuff like that. So
no, that's a really good point, because when we think about white collar crime, it doesn't get framed as the kinds of harms that like murder or armed robbery, right? But the amount of devastation and havoc that's wreaked by white collar crime and white collar criminals. I mean, like, I didn't even fully explain at the time or understand at the time, but like Enron, like what happened to those guys, right? And when incredibly wealthy people are incarcerated for their white collar crimes, like when Martha Stewart, remember she went to jail for tax evasion or whatever. Like, do you think Martha Stewart is being held in a facility that looks anything like East Baton Rouge Parish Prison? Absolutely not, right? I mean, these people are basically on places that have like golf courses, for crying out loud, right? I mean, like Martha Stewart was not put in a cage. the way, you know, people, when you get sent to Angola or what have you, right? I mean, like, again, just like the conditions of confinement are so inhumane. So I think it, you know, it's important to recognize, like, yes, we have all in like a social contract, that people need to be held accountable. But I really do want us to think about what are the conditions of confinement, and how is it that as a nation we treat people who incarcerate. You know, you essentially have to dehumanize somebody or not see their value, or not see them as human anymore, to treat them the way we treat people, right? I mean, solitary confinement is a human rights violation. And I know some people choose that because it's a safer option than what they're going to face in the prison, but that's absolutely, you know, there's just, you know, you read one study about it. That's all you need to know. Renee says, I know they're more easily forgiven as well. Yeah, the white collar criminals, right. Because, you know, again, this whole construction of crime and criminality, we can forgive a Martha Stewart much more easily than we're going to forgive a murderer. And again, I understand that those are two different kinds of crimes. But again, like thinking about that whole way that we construct criminality.
And I think even when, and this is just my personal opinion, you know, from, you know, watching news and all of that, I think that even when people who are wealthier, or I think there's a lot of the time a lot more grace and forgiveness granted to certain people based on their background, or even like famous people based on the fact that they were famous. And, you know, us not wanting to ruin their reputation and ruin their life, rather than someone who is easier for us to look the other way and decide their human rights are irrelevant, and whether they can represent themselves in the government or vote is irrelevant. We're more likely to see like a white male celebrity as like human than somebody who we've never met.
Yeah, 100%. 100%, right?
Yeah, but you know, here, this is something that I don't know if you've paid attention to this much, but if you get a serial killer or a serial rapist that goes into prison, they can't hardly handle the amount of mail that these people are going to get, and they don't.
Because they get all the fan mail.
They get that from females,
Oh
and
my God, it's
and
so.
so you know, you think, okay, you got this. Okay, someone that's a serial killer in that sense is usually somebody that's wired up a little bit differently than
Oh yeah, usually they're like
us, okay?
sociopaths. I mean, there are people who are like legit, like
Right.
need to be kept out of society. I 100%
Correct.
agree with you on that.
But the thing about it is, it's like, why is it that there are thousands and thousands of women that write letters to them, pledging them their love and anything else that they could do and all this kind of stuff, when they know for the most part they probably are what they've been in there for, and if they're not, they're probably a little nutty anyway, but yet they continue to do it. And that always has perplexed me, I guess is the right word, because I never understood it. But we think of how they are treated compared to someone who just murdered somebody in a you know, a convenience store holdup or something. They're looked at as, they don't get no mail. Okay, they hardly get any mail from their relatives. But you have this, you know, guy who's killed 7 or 8 women, and he's a superstar, and he's getting so much mail that it can hardly be, you know, because they got to go through, they open up and go through all your mail.
Yeah. Well, he might be getting mail, but I don't know that he has a better like living situation than the other inmates.
He may not, well, he may not have a better situation because he's going to probably be in a state prison unless some kind of way there's a federal charge. But you know, I see that there would be a reason why Martha Stewart is in a little bit different jail. Of course, that's a federal prison, what she's in, as opposed to the same federal prison that the bomber from the Boston bomber was in. I mean, I can understand why there's a little bit different, or that who's those people that committed all those murders in Washington? Remember, they were shooting people. It was like a sniper type of thing.
Oh yeah, the ATF had to get involved. That whole
I
situation.
forgot who it was. It was like a guy and a young. It was a man and a young guy. And hold on just a second. I need to shut this off. But it was so kind of crazy because yeah, they you know, they were in prison. I just feel like, yeah, I want for Martha Stewart to not be in the same type of prison as what somebody that's a big time murderer is. I just feel like
Yeah,
that's
but I guess I would push it, like, why do some people deserve to be treated more humanely than others? Do you know what I mean? Like, yes, I understand, like, murdering people is not a good thing, and there are degrees of crime, right? Martha Stewart didn't murder anybody, but like, why is it that we can accept that some people are put in cages, treated like total garbage, subject to sexual violence in prisons, and that we're like, like, why do we accept that for some people and not others? I guess I don't know.
because we look at one of them as being a violent crime or being of violence. Even if you think drug dealers, there's a lot of violence surrounding drug dealing versus, say, Martha Stewart, that never left her house and never did anything. And what she did was she made some she went for insider trading, wasn't it? Or
I don't know. Yeah. But
something like that.
Like, you think about the harm of, like, when, well, like, filthy rich people don't pay their taxes, or filthy rich people make all this profit on whose backs, and like the harm that causes to other people. Do you know what I mean? Ashley, did you have any insight on women who write letters to serial killers? Because it seemed like you wanted to hop in when Timothy was talking about that.
I read a book earlier this year just because it was on I don't know, I saw it on Who Plus, I read it. And I wasn't, whatever. And it's pretty off topic, so I don't want to spend too long talking about it, but it was about like female monstrosity, and she like addressed and I wasn't totally satisfied with all of her explanations, but I like she had a part about like true crime and also like women's fascination with serial killers as like a manifestation of like
misogyny.
Yeah, as misogyny,
like internalized but misogyny or something.
Yeah, internalized misogyny, as well as like she kind of ties it to the like idea of the Gothic hero, and as well as like almost like this grotesque mirror of some of the violence that women endure just as a course of life. Like most women have some experience, if not with sexual assault, most women have some experience with sexualized violence of some sort. And she kind of explores it as a way of like, as these women's way of coping with this kind of force that, you're going to encounter something like it anyway. But so here's like this grotesque romanticized version of this.
Totally fascinating.
Not explaining it well. It's by Sadie Doyle. This is like pop culture, Dead Blondes and Bad Mothers. It was fun. But anyway.
No, it's totally fascinating because, Timothy did raise the point, right? Like these serial killers. And again, like, right. And that's something else to keep in mind too. Like when we're thinking about, prison policies and what incarceration looks like, we often think about like the absolute worst people we can imagine, right? Like the serial killers, the Jeffrey Dahmers. And, but those people make up a very, very small percentage of those who are incarcerated. So I would argue that most prison policies should not be based on them. And again, I mean, those are human beings too, right? I mean, and I'm pushing myself too to like on this too, because of course, like if somebody murdered anybody in my family, like I think my automatic would be retribution, punish, hurt that person. But then it's like, what does that do? Do you know what I mean? Like people need to be held accountable, but like these kinds of inhumane treatment and inhumane response to people who have done inhumane things, I guess I'm challenging us to think about that, myself included.
And I think that because it's something that I struggle with too, but I think, but I do think there's like a difference between saying, I don't want someone who is a habitual abuser, someone who is a habitual, like, who seems to show no, whose remorse is calculated. There's a difference between wanting that person to not be able to do that again and wanting that person to just not caring if that person is submitted to torturous kind of behavior. Because not like, even if you don't care about that person's life, that sort of treatment impacts the people who work at the prison. Like it impacts lots of anybody who's kept at the prison with that person. And like, even for violent crimes, like not all things that are classified as violent crimes are like involved. And even then, like, I know someone who was a felon who committed armed robbery and, is kind of one of those people that challenges me because I'm very critical of the prisons, and he's like, oh no, man, I needed to go to prison because I'm never going to go back there. But like, even he's like a good, like, 10 years on, he's a kind person, consistently like caring, and thankfully hasn't been back because he has like a support network and friends that can help him. But like, yeah, like I think it's the difference between like somebody who's committing these acts habitually and harming habitually, being away from victims, versus I don't care if this person is tortured and kept in a cage and hurt, and somebody's hurting that person.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's a lot to think about, and like, like clearly, like, you're sociopathic people, and there are some, right? We need to have a way to keep those people out of the larger public, but there's ways to do that humanely too, right? And again, those people account for such a tiny percentage of who's actually incarcerated. And again, like, imagine a world where like your friend wouldn't have to say, oh, I'm glad I went to prison because that straightened me out. Like, imagine a world where like people didn't have to go to prison at all to begin with, right? I mean, like, how amazing would that be? And can we even imagine that world, right? Universal healthcare, access to education, ability to find employment.
Yeah, but I don't think that's ever going to stop crime, because there's too many people in crime that had everything going for them and they still committed crimes. And so I don't see that as a deterrent. It could help, but I think, I think a two-parent families probably would help most of these people, because a lot of them don't have that. They didn't have that. They didn't have a stable home life when they were a child. You can see that every time they talk, because none of them, in our group, it's sad, but so many of them, they did not know their parent, they didn't know their dad wasn't around.
Yeah.
And they didn't have the ability to have that. That makes a big difference, I think.
But I would also push back on that, because my parents got a divorce and I was essentially raised by my mom. So I was raised by a single mom. I think it's too easy to be like, well, if we just had two parents, everything would be fine. You know what I mean? Like, that's just, how many people are actually raised by single moms? I don't know that.
And they turn out good.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a lot of two-parent families are totally, like Renee says, totally dysfunctional. So there has to be something more than that,
Yeah, and look,
I'm just pushing at you because I think it's
okay.
too easy.
That's okay.
I think it's too easy of an answer.
But I will tell you that we know that is, for the majority, that would be good. But we also know people that were fine mothers and fathers, and they had a son or even a daughter, but a son that created all kinds of havoc.
Right.
And you're like, they did everything that I could see right. I mean, I knew one of them really well, and you're just going to have some bad seeds no matter what, and one of them was one of my best friends who lived next door, and he died at he died at, I don't know, I think he was 50, and he died, and it just seemed crazy, because nobody thought he was ever going to live to be all that old anyway.
Wow.
Because he just lived life in a way different way. He was fun to be around, but boy, when that temper turned on, you didn't want to be around them.
Yeah.
You know, luckily that temper had never turned on me. In fact, he was a
That's good.
protector for me. He was a couple years older. He would have never let anything happen. But you know, you just got those different people in life.
Yeah. We're all wired differently.
Wired different.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what, sociologists and criminologists and, scholars of all stripes have been trying to figure out for years and years and decades of like what causes criminality, what causes crime. Is it the parents? Is it a 1-parent, 2-parent household? Is it, is it the race? Is it an innate criminality? Like there's been all these theories, some straight up totally racist and and like whatever, like they used to think that Italians at the turn of the century were innately a criminal race, because of course race has changed over time, and what denotes race has changed over time. So yeah, it's still I think the jury's still out on a lot of that stuff, right? So all right, y'all, well, we are about to hit the 7:30 mark, so it has been another lovely conversation with you all. Thank you all for participating. Next week we will be reading, I want to type in the chat box for y'all the Sentencing Project. This is the website I had pulled up earlier that had the info on felon disenfranchisement, but y'all should check out their page because they have just lots of really good information about incarceration. So they have like sentencing policy, incarceration, drug policy, voting rights, all that. So take a minute or take many minutes to see what they have to say, and they'll give you good information on the carceral state as it exists today. So next week we'll be reading Carol Anderson's One Person No Vote. It's about voter disenfranchisement. So it brings us into, well, this was a book about the contemporary, but again, looking at some of the threats to democracy and voting rights today. Try to read some of it, y'all. Although I have to say, we had a very good conversation. Despite that, Ashley, what's up?
Renee, we are getting, I checked on the catalog a little while ago, and we have the book on CD coming, or it's like in-house. So I'm gonna check tomorrow and see if we can get it like kind of rushed out. And I'll give you a call whenever it comes in, and so that you can pick it up. And would you like to pick it up at Gonzalez? The Gonzalez Library? Okay, I will get that for you.
Perfect. Thanks for setting that up, Ashley. We appreciate that. All right, everybody. Well, have a good rest of your week. Stay safe, stay healthy. And I'll see you guys 1 week from today for our final book club. So
Thank you.